think to start with, the majority of our fashion, of our clothing is being made in low-cost countries and emerging economies, where the legislation and the enforcement of the legislation is possibly a bit weaker and civil society is less developed. Moreover, there's long and complex supply chains. So that makes, I think, the fashion supply chains as one of the most vulnerable for human rights issues. And that's also backed up with the data from SLCP. So our data shows that 90% of the factories, there is one or more violation of the national labor legislation, and the highest among the wages, working hours, and safety on the work floor. I would say, in principle, supply chain control or ensuring that there is decent working conditions should be done and could be done everywhere. If you, for instance, look at quality, food quality, wherever the product comes from, there is a proper system in place. So if there is the willingness, I think it can be done, but it will come at a cost. And as you also know, fashion, the margins sometimes are lower. So that is one aspect of it. And there also needs to be, if companies want to control labor conditions in their supply chain, there needs to be what we call enabling factors. So that willingness, you need to show that from brands also having proper purchasing practices, paying their manufacturers on time, paying prices that also allow for a good wage and good conditions for the workers. For instance, I've seen sometimes the best examples of factories and countries where we wouldn't expect it. So a long answer to this question, I think it is doable. A lot of things need to be in place to ensure that. But if we all work together, it can be done. I think a decent work is a responsibility for all parties involved. So that means labor unions, the worker representatives, governments, and companies. In the past 25 years, there have been a lot of initiatives from the private sector, so from brands mostly, to use the term of corporate social responsibility and to implement things like codes of conduct, etc., as a way to improve working conditions. I think this is all, and there are applaudable initiatives, but it is a proxy. Long term, it should be the governments to protect their citizens with proper legislation and enforcement. And that should be balanced by a strong civil society. And with civil society, I mean NGOs, but also definitely worker representatives like local labor unions. So just referring back to the UN guiding principles, where there is a role for different parties to protect, respect, and remedy working conditions. And there are the definitions of concrete and actionable steps for all of them, including governments and companies, to meet their respective duties and responsibilities. I think also governments can do a lot in terms of holding brands, companies accountable on their own grounds, and to ensure that there is due diligence in the supply chains. Governments in local production countries, they have an important role to play to ensure that there is proper legislation in place and enforced in terms of protecting the workers who are making our fashion. I think this, the question on whether a local supply chain is, or short supply chain is a better option, has a nuanced and maybe a bit more of a complicated answer. So I think from an environmental perspective, yes. The shorter the supply chain and the more locally sourced, that saves a lot of issues in terms of climate and energy. The reality is that fashion is being made of different materials and different qualities. So as long as we think that differentiation is needed, the reality is that global supply chains will be a bit more complex and longer. Every country, every production unit comes with its own specialization. So that's one of these reasons. And also on the other side, so the fashion or the apparel industry is a low entry industry. So it does provide job opportunities to people who otherwise have fewer options, and particularly women. I believe Rana Plaza was a turning point. It was a horrible disaster, and many workers lost their lives because of it. Yet I think it is a major wake-up call. I'm an optimistic person, and I think it was maybe it's started with reputational protection as a trigger. But I do think it was an eye-opener in the sense that also having proper working conditions along the supply chains and in the facilities where the fashion is being produced is a shared obligation for everyone to meet minimum human rights. But I also think it's made a realization that resilience in global supply chains is also common sense from a business perspective. So I would say it's not just a reputation, but there are also other, probably more long-term factors that come into play. I think governments, Western countries have their role to play next to other parties like the companies and civil society organizations. I think a promising discussion right now is around human rights due diligence in global supply chains, where there is an active role and where the initiative is in the first place with governments. And I think if this is well implemented in a harmonized way, it can really move the needle. I also believe that in the international discussions from government to government, there is work to be done, and that can make a change in terms of creating a level playing field in terms of labor legislation, where the ILO conventions should be used as the baseline, and credible data around what's the current status, where are the priorities to improve, should be the input for those discussions. I strongly believe in the need for systemic change to improve working conditions. With systemic change, I mean the dynamics in the supply chain, the relationship between manufacturer and brand, but also, say, more of the society at large. And initiatives such as human rights due diligence also define that there is a clear role for everyone to play. I also believe that there is a role for consumers, and that they need to be educated. And that does fit in a holistic approach. I do think that a simple one score or an on-product hallmark for a complex topic as working conditions in long, global, complex fashion supply chains, there are also limiting issues with that. So yes to consumer education, but let's ensure that we do not make it in a too simplistic approach for something that really needs an systemic change and where all parties need to take the responsibility. I think brands really have to beef up their game, and it all starts with embedding really the drive for change in company policy and also in the management system. So it needs to come from the top, and it's not just controlling the supply chains and finger pointing at manufacturers, but it needs a holistic approach that includes also improved purchasing practices. The brands need to start with mapping what are the risks in their supply chains, which products, which manufacturing units, which countries have a specific risk in terms of labor conditions, and then come up with a plan to avoid or reduce those risks and invest in improvement programs. And as these are really complex topics, it requires brands to work collectively in collaborative programs. It is about continuous improvement, and the problems are, as I mentioned, too big to handle by one brand itself. It requires systemic approach, starting with measuring the conditions, and from there onwards really make steps to work to a level that is acceptable. And in these collaborative programs, tools like SLCP, where brands can be supported in having access to credible data, and while refocusing their resources towards improvement programs, can really make a difference. I think we need legislation in principle is a mandate of national governments. I do think harmonization between countries is required, but the baseline in terms of human rights are the ILO labor conventions and UN human rights. So if we all respect those, and we respect that national governments can implement proper legislation and enforce those, referencing so what we all globally agree on, then that is, I think, one unlock to the to improvement. From our data, we see that there is, in the majority of the factories, and we have now really a big pool of data, 90% there is not even in 90% there is well, I'll retake this one, sorry. Your question was which are the biggest problems? Yeah. So from our data, we see that in 90% of the factories, there is at least one violation of the minimum local laws. So that's the basics. And we see the top three among those violations. It is on wages, it is on working hours, structural overtime, beyond the 60 hours a week, which is really quite severe. And then there is occupational health and safety. So workers are not even, when they're working in the factories, there's issue with the basic conditions, and they're not protected for accidents, etc. I think so that the top three, wages, working hours, and occupational health and safety, that's what we see in our data. Then on top of that, there are more salient aspects which are harder to get, but what we know that they're around harassment at the workplace. And that's also around, for instance, freedom of association. So the right to have a labor union and to organize yourself and to have proper negotiations on what we were just saying, the biggest issues, wages and benefits, working hours, and occupational health and safety.